Hey guys, here we are reading the Darwin and Evolution homework packet. Just again taking a look at our reading preview concepts, reading preview and key concepts. Here are the most important things to be looking for. What important observations did Darwin make on his voyage? Differences between similar species, and how does natural selection lead to evolution? Some key terms, things like species, fossil, adaptation, evolution, uh, scientific theory, natural selection, and variation. I would say the most important ones here are adaptation, evolution, natural selection, and variation, because those are probably things you haven't really dealt with before, so things to keep an eye on. All right, let's get started. In December 1831, the British ship HMS Beagle set sail from England on a 5-year trip around the world. On board was a 22-year-old named Charles Darwin. Darwin eventually became the ship's naturalist, a person who studies the natural world. His job was to learn as much as he could about the living things he saw on the voyage. Darwin observed plants and animals he had never seen before. He wondered why they were so different from those in England. Darwin's observations led him to develop one of the most important scientific theories of all time, the theory of evolution by natural selection. So important to note here that evolution and natural selection are inherently linked. That means that they are linked and there's no way to separate them. Here's a little map of his voyage, which connects onto the other page, which you don't really get to see, but it's from England down around Australia, etc. See, here it is. England, came down this way, over to Australia, from Australia, over here, back up. There you go. All right. Darwin's observations. As you can see in Figure 1, the Beagle made many stops along the coast of South America. From there, the ship traveled to the Galapagos Islands. Darwin observed living things as he traveled. He thought about relationships among those organisms. Darwin's important observations included the diversity of living things, the remains of ancient organisms, and the characteristics of organisms on the Galapagos Islands. Diversity. Darwin was amazed by the tremendous diversity of living things that he saw. In Brazil, he saw insects that looked like flowers and ants that marched across the forest floor like huge armies. In Argentina, he saw sloths, animals that moved very slowly and spent much of their time hanging in the trees. Today, scientists know that organisms are even more diverse than Darwin could have ever imagined. Scientists have identified more than 1.7 million species of organisms on Earth. A species is a group of similar organisms that can mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. So sometimes people get confused about species because technically a donkey and a horse can mate and they create a mule, but a mule is not fertile. That means it can't have babies itself. So a mule is not its own necessarily set of species. All right, fossils. Darwin saw the fossil bones of animals that had died long ago. A fossil is the preserved remains of traces of an organism that lived in the past. Darwin was puzzled by some of the fossils he observed. For example, he saw fossil bones that resembled the bones of living sloths. The fossil bones were much larger than those of the sloths that were alive in Darwin's time. He wondered what had happened to the giant creatures from the past. Galapagos organisms. In 1835, the Beagle reached the Galapagos Islands. Darwin observed many unusual life forms on these small islands, such as giant tortoises or land turtles. Some of these tortoises looked him in the eye. After returning to England, Darwin thought about the organisms he had seen. He compared Galapagos organisms to organisms that lived elsewhere. He also compared organisms on different islands in the Galapagos group. He was surprised by some of the similarities and differences he saw. Comparisons to South American organisms. Darwin found many similarities between Galapagos organisms and those in South America. Many of the birds on the islands, including hawks, mockingbirds, and finches, resembled those on the mainland. Many of the plants were similar to plants Darwin had collected on the mainland. However, there were important differences between the organisms on the islands and those on the mainland. The iguanas on the Galapagos Islands had large claws that allowed them to grip slippery rocks, where they fed on seaweed. The iguanas on the mainland had smaller claws. Smaller claws allowed the mainland iguanas to climb trees, where they ate leaves. You can see these differences in Figure 2. Not the best picture, but these are the ones from the mainland, and then these are the ones from the Galapagos Islands. So they have big claws, and they were eating seaweed, and the ones from South America had smaller claws and were eating in trees. So he's up on the tree. From his observations, Darwin hypothesized that a small number of different plant and animal species had come to the Galapagos Islands from the mainland. They might have been blown out to sea during a storm, or set adrift on a fallen log. Once the plants and animals reached the islands, they reproduced. Eventually, their offspring became different from their mainland relatives. Comparisons among the islands. As he traveled from one Galapagos island to the next, Darwin also noticed many differences among organisms. For example, the tortoises on one island had dome-shaped shells. Those on another island had saddle-shaped shells. That's hard to say quickly. A government official in the islands told Darwin that he could tell which island a tortoise came from just by looking at its shell. Adaptations. Like the tortoises, the finches on the Galapagos were noticeably different from one island to the next. The most obvious differences were the varied sizes and shapes of the birds' beaks, as shown in Figure 3. We'll go up to that in a second. An examination of the different finches showed that each species was well suited to the life it led. Finches that ate insects had narrow, needle-like beaks. Finches that ate seeds had strong, wide beaks. So let's take a look at Figure 3. Here we go. Get the strong, big beaks for cracking seeds, small needle-nosed beaks for what? Let me see. What does it say? Eating insects. So these guys probably ate insects, and then these are probably cracking tough seeds. Okay. Beak shape is an example of an adaptation, a trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce. The finch's beak structures help in obtaining food. Other adaptations help organisms avoid being eaten. For example, some plants, such as milkweed, are poisonous or have a bad taste. A variety of adaptations aid in reproduction. The bright colors of some flowers attract insects. When an insect lands on a flower, the insect may pick up pollen grains, which produce sperm. The insect then may carry the pollen grains to another flower, enabling fertilization to take place. Evolution. After he returned to England, Darwin continued to think about what he had seen during his voyage on the Beagle. Darwin spent the next 20 years consulting with other scientists, gathering more information and thinking through his ideas. Darwin's reasoning. Darwin especially wanted to understand the different adaptations of organisms on the Galapagos Islands. Darwin reasoned that plants or animals that arrived on the Galapagos Islands faced conditions that were different from those on the mainland. Perhaps, Darwin hypothesized, the species gradually changed over many generations and became better adapted to the new conditions. The gradual change in a species over time is called evolution. Darwin's ideas are often referred to as the theory of evolution. A scientific theory is a well-tested concept that explains a wide range of observations. From the evidence he collected, Darwin concluded that organisms on the Galapagos Islands had changed over time. However, Darwin did not know how the changes had happened. Selective breeding. Darwin studied other examples of changes in living things to help him understand how evolution might occur. One example that Darwin studied was the offspring of animals produced by selective breeding. English farmers in Darwin's time used selective breeding to produce sheep with fine wool. Darwin himself had bred pigeons with large, fan-shaped tails. By repeatedly allowing only those pigeons with many tail feathers to mate, breeders had produced pigeons with 2 or 3 times the usual number of tail feathers. Darwin thought that a process similar to selective breeding might happen in nature, but he wondered what process selected certain traits. Another example is for racehorses. So racehorses are selectively bred to obtain the trait of speed, to be really fast and strong. Funnyside's father, distorted humor, and great-grandfather, Seattle Slew, were known for their speed. All right, we'll come back up to this picture in a minute. Natural selection. In 1858, Darwin and another British biologist, Alfred Russel Wallace, each proposed an explanation for how evolution could occur in nature. The next year, Darwin described this mechanism in a book entitled The Origin of Species. In his book, Darwin proposed that evolution occurs by means of natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than other members of the same species. Darwin identified factors that affect the process of natural selection: overproduction, competition, and variations. In Figure 5 and Figure 6, they show how natural selection might happen in a group of turtles. Let's take a look at this for a quick second. So, for example, overproduction means that the turtles lay many eggs, and not all of the young babies will survive, which is sad, but true. Variation: each turtle has slightly different traits. For example, some turtles can move faster than others. Thinking about the larkies, overproduction, they would have 9 babies at a time. And remember, when we were doing the natural selection, pulling the tiles, not every larky survived, and so we didn't write everyone down. Then the variation was that of the ones that did survive, there were still a variation of traits, right? Slightly different traits. All right, let's keep reading. Darwin knew that most species produce far more offspring than can possibly survive. In many species, so many offspring are produced that there are not enough resources, food, water, and living space, for all of them. Many female insects, for example, lay thousands of eggs. If all newly hatched insects survived, they would soon crowd out all other plants and animals. Darwin knew that this doesn't happen. Why not? As you learned in your study of genetics, members of a species differ from one another in many of their traits. Any difference between individuals of the same species is called a variation. For example, certain insects may be able to eat foods that other insects of their species avoid. The color of a few insects may be different from that of most other insects in their species. We'll come back up here in a minute. Competition. Since food and other resources are limited, the members of a species must compete with each other to survive. Competition does not always involve direct physical fights between members of a species. Instead, competition is usually indirect. For example, many insects do not find enough to eat. Others are caught by predators. Only a few insects will survive. Selection. Darwin observed that some variations make individuals better adapted to their environment. Those individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce. Their offspring may inherit the helpful characteristic. The offspring, in turn, will be more likely to survive and reproduce and thus pass on the characteristic to their offspring. After many generations, more members of the species will have the helpful characteristic. In effect, the environment has selected organisms with helpful traits to become the parents of the next generation. Darwin proposed that over a long time, natural selection can lead to change. Helpful variations may gradually accumulate in a species, while unfavorable ones may disappear. Let's look up here for a quick second. So thinking about the turtles, right? Overproduction, many eggs were laid, not all of the babies lived. Of the ones who lived, there were variations, right? And now there's competition. Turtles compete with one another. A faster turtle may escape from a predator. And then selection. Variations such as speed make some turtles better able to survive in the environment. Basically, it's just saying that the environment sort of selects down to the few that are the best suited, the most likely to live. Environmental change. A change in the environment can affect an organism's ability to survive. The environmental change can therefore lead to selection. For example, monkey flowers are a type of plant. Most monkey flowers cannot grow in soil that has a high concentration of copper. However, because of genetic variation, some species of monkey flower now grow near copper mines, in spite of the copper in the soil. Here's how natural selection might have resulted in monkey flowers that can grow in copper-contaminated soil. When the soil around a mine first became contaminated, a small number of monkey flower plants may have been able to survive in the high level of copper. These plants grew and reproduced. After many generations, most of the seeds that sprouted in the soil produced monkey flowers that could withstand the copper. Genes and natural selection. Without variations, all the members of a species would have the same traits. Natural selection would not occur because all individuals would have an equal chance of surviving and reproducing. But where do variations come from? How are they passed on from parents to offspring? Darwin could not explain what caused variations or how they were passed on. As scientists later learned, variations can result from mutation and the shuffling of alleles during meiosis. Meiosis is the creation of sex cells. Genes are passed from parents to their offspring. Because of this, only traits that are inherited or controlled by genes can be acted upon by natural selection. So this is the last part of the turtle story, right? If they survive, then they reproduce. Only a few turtles survive long enough to reproduce. The offspring may inherit the favorable traits of the parents. All right, last section here, evidence of evolution. Let's take a look at the reading preview. What evidence supports the theory of evolution? How do scientists infer evolutionary relationships among organisms? And how do new species form? Two big important terms here. This one, homologous structures, going to come up a lot, very important to know. And then branching tree is a type of diagram that we'll take a look at. All right, let's get going. Does natural selection occur today? Evidence indicates that the answer is yes. Consider, for example, what happens when chemicals called pesticides are used to kill harmful insects such as the cockroaches below. When a pesticide is first used in a building, it kills almost all the insects, but a few insects have traits that protect them from the pesticide. These insects survive. The surviving insects reproduce. Some of their offspring inherit the pesticide protection. The surviving offspring, in turn, reproduce. Every time the pesticide is used, the only insects that survive are those that are resistant to the harmful effects of the pesticide. After many years, most of the cockroaches in the building are resistant to the pesticide. Therefore, the pesticide is no longer effective in controlling the insects. The development of pesticide resistance is one type of evidence that supports Darwin's theory of evolution and is gross. All right, interpreting the evidence. Since Darwin's time, scientists have found a great deal of evidence that supports the theory of evolution. Fossils, patterns of early development, and similar body structures all provide evidence that organisms have changed over time. Big key point, remember in the key concepts? These are the three things they're saying are the pieces of evidence. Fossils. By examining fossils, scientists can infer the structures of ancient organisms. Fossils show that, in many cases, organisms that lived in the past were very different than organisms alive today. You will learn more about the importance of fossils in the next section. Similarities in early development. Scientists also make inferences about evolutionary relationships by comparing the early development of different organisms. Suppose you were asked to compare an adult fish, salamander, chicken, and possum. You would probably say they look quite different from each other. However, during early development, these four organisms are similar, as you will see in Figure 8. For example, during the early stages of development, all four organisms have a tail and a row of tiny slits along their throats. These similarities suggest that these vertebrate species are related and share a common ancestor. You can't see them! That stinks. Well, you can kind of see a tail and sort of the ball up here, ball, tail. It's supposed to all look pretty similar. Imagine like babies in development before they're born. They all look pretty similar across all those different species: fish, salamander, chicken, and possum. We'll look at some of these in a lab. Similarities in body structure. Long ago, scientists began to compare the body structures of living species to look for clues about evolution. In fact, this is how Darwin came to understand that evolution had occurred on the Galapagos Islands. An organism's body structure is its basic body plan, such as how its bones are arranged. Fishes, that's weird, shouldn't it be fish? Fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, for example, all have a similar body structure, an internal skeleton with a backbone. This is why scientists classify all 5 groups of animals together as vertebrates. All of these groups probably inherited a similar structure from an early vertebrate ancestor that they shared. Look closely at the structure of the bones in the bird's wing, dolphin's flipper, and dog's leg that are shown in Figure 9. Notice that the bones in the forelimbs of these 3 animals are arranged in a similar way. These similarities provide evidence that these three organisms all evolved from a common ancestor. Similar structures that related species have inherited from a common ancestor are known as homologous structures. Similar structures that species inherited from a common ancestor. So let's take a look at some. Here are the homologous structures they were just talking about. The dolphin, it almost looks like a hand, doesn't it? Bird has similar, so they all have this bone, these two bones next to each other, and then the hand-like structure. This bone, the two bones, and then a hand-like structure. Here's a crocodile, something very similar, right? This bone, the two bones, and then the hand-like structure. Do you think that they share a common ancestor with birds, dolphins, and dogs? Probably, right? They look very similar to dolphins. Okay, sometimes scientists find fossils that support the evidence provided by homologous structures. For example, scientists have recently found fossils of ancient whale-like creatures. The fossils show that the ancestors of today's whales had legs and walked on land. This evidence supports other evidence that whales and humans share a common ancestor. Inferring species relationships. Fossils, early development patterns, and body structures provide evidence that evolution has occurred. Scientists have also used these kinds of evidence to infer how organisms are related to one another. Not too long ago, fossils, embryos, and body structures were the only tools that scientists had to determine how species were related. Today, scientists can also compare the DNA and protein sequences of different species. Scientists have combined the evidence from DNA, protein structure, fossils, early development, and body structure to determine the evolutionary relationships among species. So they added a couple more in here. So DNA and protein structure are also really important now in understanding their relationships. Similarities in DNA. Why do some species have similar body structures and development patterns? Scientists infer that the species inherited many of the same genes from a common ancestor. Recently, scientists have begun to compare the genes of different species to determine how closely related the species are. Recall that genes are made of DNA. By comparing the sequence of nitrogen bases, the base pairs, in DNA of different species, scientists can infer how closely related the two species are. The more similar the DNA sequence is, the more closely related the species are. For example, DNA analysis has shown that elephants and tiny elephant shrews are closely related. This little guy and this are closely related. It's crazy. The DNA bases along a gene specify what type of protein will be produced. Therefore, scientists can also compare the order of amino acids in a protein to see how closely related two species are. Combining evidence. In most cases, evidence from DNA and protein structure has confirmed conclusions based on fossils, embryos, and body structure. For example, recent DNA comparisons show that dogs are more similar to wolves than they are to coyotes. Scientists had already reached this conclusion based on similarities in the structure and development of these three species. Sometimes, however, scientists have changed their hypotheses about species relationships. For example, lesser pandas were once thought to be closely related to giant pandas. Recently, however, DNA analysis and other methods have shown that giant pandas and lesser pandas are not closely related. Instead, giant pandas are more closely related to bears, while lesser pandas are more closely while lesser pandas are more closely related to raccoons. I mean, it makes sense. Look how much they look alike. Look how much they look alike. That makes sense. Scientists use the combined evidence of species relationships to draw branching trees. A branching tree is a diagram that shows how scientists think different groups of organisms are related. Figure 11 shows how raccoons, lesser pandas, giant pandas, and bears may be related. So there's a common ancestor a long time ago that split into two different species. And each of those species split into two different species that we see today. How do new species form? Natural selection explains how variations can lead to changes in a species. But how could an entirely new species form? A new species can form when a group of individuals remains isolated from the rest of its species long enough to evolve different traits. Isolation or complete separation occurs when some members of a species become cut off from the rest of the species. Maybe a fire rips through their mountain habitat and larvae have to spread to the forest and the prairie. Or maybe other things happen too. Group members may be separated by such things like a river, a volcano, or a mountain range. Albert squirrel and the kabab squirrel both live in forests in the southwest. As you can see in figure 12, the populations of the two kinds of squirrel are separated by the Grand Canyon. So here's the Grand Canyon. And up here must be the Albert squirrel. Down here must be the kabab squirrel. The kabab and Albert squirrels belong to the same species, but they have slightly different characteristics. For example, the kabab squirrel has a black belly, while Albert squirrel has a white belly. It is possible that one day, I've been saying Albert, but it's Abert squirrel. It is possible that one day Abert squirrel and the kabab squirrel will become so different from each other that they will be separate species. Time will tell. That's all. Hope you enjoyed. Hope it's helpful. Of course, if you have questions, please see me.